Hello, hi, my name's Will Harris. I'm the author of a book called Rendang, which came out earlier this year, and I also wrote a small essay book called Mixed Race Superman, which came out a couple of years ago now. Yeah, that's right. And I'm joined by Nina Mingya Powles, who is the author of the brilliant Magnolia, published earlier this year by Wesleyan Press. And she's a New Zealand writer, also the author of Tiny Moons, a food memoir. And what we're going to do is have, as part of the bottom drawer, the idea is we talk about the ideas behind our work, the development of it, the stuff, I guess, at the bottom of the drawer. So what we're going to do is begin by sharing a poem each, and then we're going to share some things, kind of in the broadest sense, which have been important to our work or the development of it, which led to the making of our books. So I'm going to pass over to Nina now. Some poem.
Yeah, thank you, Will. This is really great. Thanks for asking me to be a part of it. I'll start then with a poem from Magnolia. It's not one I've often read aloud, but and it's a prose poem, and I thought it might kind of suit our conversation later. So this is called April Kowhai. Kowhai is a type of native New Zealand tree. April Kowhai. When the April heat wave came, my mum sent a WeChat video from Malaysia of an evening downpour. You can't see the rain, only the effects of it, a gasp from her mouth and a yellow flame tree reflected in the wet, shaking. I see a yellow blur from far away and walk closer, disbelieving. Here is a kowhai tree on the edge of a garden in North London, in full bloom. For a moment I do not breathe air, I breathe yellow, I breathe myself home. My phone is vibrating, telling me, you have a new memory. Here is a stream of pictures collected into an album, all taken somewhere far away. Home is not a place, but a string of colours threaded together and knotted at one end. Koanga, springtime, often synonymous with kowhai, yellow. In another time and place, I watch the hills above the house turn gold. When people say things like, the hottest April day in 60 years, it becomes necessary to make note of the bright heat of the concrete, the fallen magnolias with their shy blood roots, the fingernail kowhai blooms curling translucently like discarded chrysalids. Be still, you have a new memory. Ua kowhai, light spring showers, or kowhai showers, when the world becomes a sea of yellow. I now know it can happen anywhere, even somewhere cold. In her childhood bedroom, my mum slides back the mosquito net and holds her phone up against the window pane, recording the rain. Thanks.
Amazing. Okay. Kind of like to talk about that, but maybe I should share a poem first. I'm going to share one which is maybe distantly related to it. It's called, well, first I should say it's loosely inspired by the film Flash, which was a film I watched when I was pretty young, had quite a big influence on me. And it has this, the main antagonist is this evil character called Ming the Merciless, who was played by an actor called Max von Sydow. Though at the time I didn't realize that it was man in yellow face, because I was a child. And that's a pretty crazy thing to do. Okay, and it's called Pathetic Earthlings. Planet Mongo is underdeveloped in certain respects. Most of its terrain is purple rock, but they do have hovercrafts and telepathy, So while you're flying from the imperial palace to visit your cousin beyond the purple rocks and the ice mounds they call Phrygia, you can put a plastic halo over your head and think to your cousin, as the Mongo people say, and be talking to him as if you were inside each other's head or on hands-free. Though impressive technologically, this has one defect. You can't refuse to take a telepathic call. Suddenly, you're inside their head and they're inside of yours, and what if your cousin is in a bad mood or having sex with his wife or another woman, or masturbating over something terrible? I have a cousin called Ming, and people say I look like him, which is uncomfortable because though he may not be evil, he's done bad things. When I tell people this and say his name is Ming, they laugh because I assume it's such an evil-sounding name. Ming doesn't wear red suits trimmed with gold, isn't bald, and doesn't have facial hair like a court jester's parted legs. But sometimes that's how I think of him too. And if even I can't help thinking of him like that, then maybe he couldn't help becoming kind of evil over time. I think to him, my hovercraft skimming over the purple wastes of planet Mongo, and enter his consciousness just as he sits down on the toilet, malaria obsessed, the only decoration in his bathroom a picture of his daughter he can't look at now without crying, wondering when it was his life turned so thoroughly fucking evil. He didn't start out wanting to be rich and powerful, to sleep with anyone other than his wife necessarily. I could be thinking to him more mercy than he would himself allow. We haven't spoken in 9 years. Perhaps, like Emperor Ming, he's only sitting in his version of a palace, eyebrows arched, tormenting pathetic earthlings. I think to him, I really do, but you can never know for certain whose head you're
Mm, thank you.
I kind of wanted to read that one because as I was reading over your book again, one of the things I love about it is the engagement with films, how many films recur, and also obviously not good films necessarily. Often quite like
Yeah.
often quite like low art. Like in particular, what is it? The Great Wall, the Matt Damon film, which is like a really kind of interesting, quite like problematic film in many ways. Right. I was just kind of wondering what like drew you to films, or like were they like was that a big part of like the process, the inspiration behind some of these?
Yeah, I never used to really write about films, but most of the book was written when I was living in Shanghai as a student, and I used to go to the movies by myself all the time because tickets were really cheap, and it was like a great thing that I could go and do on my own. And the kinds of movies that generally are released, like to the most of the movie theaters in China, will be like the big blockbuster ones, along with Chinese movies, but the Western ones that would come out, I would go and see like the latest Mission Impossible, that kind of thing. And so I would see all these movies, and of course The Great Wall was like partly kind of a Chinese production. I went to see that, and that was just crazy. It's a crazy movie. I don't know how it ended up in the poem, but I guess that poem that you're talking about, which is one of the early poems in the collection, is kind of a love poem. And it's I like the novelty of pairing it with something like a love poem, which maybe Zhang Yimou or Matt Damon didn't intend.
Yeah, I guess I love the idea that you're always kind of seeing through other things, and you kind of bring those like mediating kind of like cultural forces or like WeChat conversations or videos to the surface. It's like a love poem you can't just have a love poem between two people. It has to be mediated by like a trashy film or by all the kind of cultural signifiers of of like Asianness within Western cinema, like in the Mulan films, or talk about
I mean, I think you do the same thing. I think for me, it's like I can't really avoid writing about these things, but a film like The Great Wall, which, like you say, is such a strange portrayal of like, it's like a sci-fi essentially, but kind of a version of like Chinese history, really bizarre. And how can I kind of, it's like there's no other way for me to kind of process that or begin to try and understand what it's doing. So instead, I'll just kind of put it in a love poem because I'm not sure. Yeah, but those things are hovering around us, like things we watched when we were little. And I think they come out in poems. And yeah. Did you want to start with your
Oh
first
yeah, sorry.
project?
Oh yeah. Do you want to go first or should I?
How about you go first?
Okay. All right. I'll start with this one, which kind of links. So, because this is, I guess, about how we got to putting together this book. One of the first book-like things I put together, I just printed myself with because I think this is one of the things that links us as well, that we both kind of like making things. Maybe you don't know this about me actually, but I also like making, but on a much smaller scale. So about, I think now 4 years ago, me and the artist Ashafar put together this little pamphlet and just printed them ourselves. And this is one of the offcut ones, so it's kind of printed quite back, like upside down by mistake. But just like this, which is a little pamphlet which has art and images in it, and in a series of sonnets which I wrote about museums and museum objects. I had this idea of, well, I guess I was kind of like casting around for things to write about, and I decided to spend one day in the British Museum just walking around making notes in all the different rooms, and it's where I found this. I hadn't realised they still had this room called the Enlightenment Gallery, which has lots of links to Southeast Asia, because it has a lot of the collection of Raffles there. So Stanford Raffles, who was the governor of Singapore for a while, and he acquired a huge amount of. He acquired a huge number of objects which he brought back and were bought by the British Museum. And one of the weird, jarring things about the Enlightenment Gallery, and maybe you could say about the Enlightenment Project itself, is that you've got all these things alongside each other which have no seeming relationship other than empire. So you've got a mummified head, and you've got a wayang mask from Java. So, you know, an Egyptian like literal skull, and a mask from Javanese shadow play. You know, completely different cultures, but they're kind of like bound by like basically the empire and the weird ahistorical time in which empire exists, and that's still there, preserved in this museum. So I started thinking about poems as doing a similar thing, and how you can kind of re-temporalize objects through poems.
Did any of those sonnets make it into Rendang?
Yes, they did.
Oh, in Rendang, there's a mask.
Yeah, they basically made it into the. There was a poem here a sonnet called "Identity Crisis," which basically became this much shorter poem. So I have this thing, I kind of like writing in form, but I also hate form as well, or I hate what I've then made and have this immediate desire to destroy it. So this has become a prose poem here. And actually this was also previously part of a sonnet, which I then took out all the other parts and left that in. And then that's also, that's basically what became of this entire pamphlet, of these 3 pages in the book.
How do you feel now about those sonnets? Like, are they their own poems in themselves, or are they kind of early versions?
I think they're very. What's nice about a pamphlet, I think, is that I think they are themselves. They are a thing in themselves. As in, they're quite like. Because I was writing this form, they're a bit stiffer and more like austere than maybe I'd write now, but it feels quite true to this project, which, though I wouldn't really write like that now, and I feel a bit uncomfortable with some of it or a bit embarrassed by it, I'm kind of happy that it exists in this form in a way that I wouldn't be, obviously, if they were just like drafts in my computer. It'd just be like, oh, that's a bad poem. because I'm like, now this is a project which exists in this form and had its endpoint. Do you feel like that when you, I don't know, is that part of the pamphlet making impulse for you at all?
Yeah, actually, that just made me think, sometimes by putting a work out there, by which I mean maybe just printing it myself, or yeah, like you did, it's sometimes easy to then move on from it or transform it, because you've kind of almost like finished the first iteration of it, and like be done done with that. But it doesn't have to mean you're finished with the work. I think what I love is that I've sometimes put things out there which are not necessarily finished, but are like the currently kind of the most complete they'll be, but I know that I might come back to them later. That's really freeing for me.
Yeah, completely. Yeah, I think that's something I am kind of obsessed with, partly because of our whole like culture really prizes this idea of quality and of like knowing whether something's good, and that also implies an idea that something's finished. Whereas, you know, like especially when you start doing workshops, either going to workshops, or like giving them, being part of, you know, everyone wants to know. You know, you kind of, it's part of setting the dynamic of it. That, you know, is it done? Is it good? Is it, you know?
Yeah.
For me, it's like, so that way of thinking about poetry just like takes out all the kind of life of it. You know, I like the idea of revisiting things and changing them, and that they, yeah.
So
Sorry, yeah.
should I maybe show one of mine, my first one?
Yeah, I'd love to see it.
So I thought I had an older one, but this is maybe the second zine that I ever made. And it's called Scylla, perhaps Scylla, a love story, and it's erasure poetry. So I had a big erasure phase when I was about 19 or maybe 20. And I think it was inspired by like coming across Mary Ruefle's erasure work, which she's like published beautifully into like tiny little books. And she takes like old, I think 18th and 19th century books and uses whiteout. So I used masking tape on pages of the Odyssey, translated by, I think which translation? The translation by Ryu, so an old one. It's really strange. I'll try and show.
Yeah, I'd love to.
So actually, it opens with a.
Or even hear it.
Well, I don't know how I can even read it, but
It's kind of visual poetry rather than.
yeah, it starts with an image of Scylla, who's a sea monster, from a vase from 450 BC, and then I've got the erased pages, which might be a little hard to see, but they're like this.
Oh, cool. What are the?
So this page, shall I read this page?
Yeah.
I kissed him, his blood lunged. That's just one page there. So I think I really enjoyed more like the visual aspect of putting this together, and I was just learning about kind of laying out pages. This was during my MA year, so I was writing an MA in poetry, but I was really halfway through the year, I think I was like bored with my project and a bit stuck, and so I got out of that stuckness by making zines basically, and this was one of them. And it's also in the middle spread has got two photographs that I took a long time ago now of I think they are the Marlborough Sounds in New Zealand. Yeah, so this is one that I've never reprinted either, so I just kind of like that it existed once, and I've got a copy, and maybe like 30 other people might have a copy.
It's really interesting that you started with Erasure poems. It's like the first thing you made.
I think I was very much spellbound by Knox by Anne Carson,
Oh yeah.
and the way that she like rubs out that poem by Catullus. Is it Catullus? I think so. And like dictionary definitions, and she kind of like paints over them in watercolor and like scribbles, and that really like changed my idea of what writing could be, and poetry, you know, just blew my mind.
Yeah. I mean, it's cool, and I wonder if that's all linked to the whole zine making, to see poetry as a kind of art making rather than as something which is just literary.
Absolutely. I think from really early on, and sounds like maybe the same for you, I think I saw myself as a maker just as much as a writer, and the two are very much connected, and it's definitely still true now, and it extends to other things that I've been trying out, like printmaking or drawing and stuff like that. I keep wanting to make things even when I can't write things, or especially when I can't write things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really cool approach, and I think it's so liberating. I was just reading something Vani Capildeo wrote about the difference between a book and a collection. She talks about the collection as something which kind of many hands were involved in. You know, it's the arrangement of different poems, and they could be arranged in lots of different ways. Whereas a book is this kind of integrated thing, which can only really be read in its entirety. And obviously, you can dip in and out of it, but is conceived as a whole. It kind of makes me think of that, the art project, because I don't know. How do you feel about Magnolia in that
That's
sense?
a good question, because I know that I think I've read that you think of Rendang as almost like one long poem, or like a book-length project, right?
Yeah.
And I love that, and
Yeah.
I think making pamphlets and zines has really made me. I basically can only write things like in sequences and in projects, but of all the things I've kind of created, I feel like Magnolia's actually got more sort of poems that can stand on their own, which is quite different for me. I wonder if that's maybe a product of the time period when I was writing. It was quite scattered, and I wasn't kind of consciously writing a project, or like you say, writing a book in the way that Vani Capildeo describes it. So I think the result is a little bit more scattered, and now I'm like turning to things that are very much like a project of, I don't know, 10 prose poems, that kind of thing. I'm very much drawn to sequences, because I love, like with Rendang, there being each piece speaks to the other pieces. I find it really hard to, like in a workshop or something, to think of a standalone poem. Like it's almost inconceivable to me right now.
in your work, or
in my own work, yeah, in my own.
Yeah, I have that too. I have that, but which is, I guess, one of the main ways that poems are shared now is by social media, on like Instagram and Twitter, and I'm always a bit uncomfortable with that. Not because of any copyright thing, that is maybe, but just because I feel like it doesn't. Once you take it away, it doesn't really make that much sense for me a lot.
Agree.
And actually, honestly, I don't think it's really that well served by being screenshot.
I feel like for a reader, it could be very different to encounter one piece of the whole, isolated from the whole. It could actually be really powerful, you know. I think for us though, it feels like that lone piece is kind of just like really lonely and doesn't make sense on its own. But I think I've learned that perhaps like at a poetry reading, obviously because you can't give all that context if you're just maybe going to read one or two poems, but it can maybe translate the way that we intend in surprising ways.
Yeah. Did you want to share something else?
Sure. Actually, I had one thing that is like not my next object, but I just found it, so I just want to show it because I actually created it after reading Mixed Race Superman, which is
Oh,
this little,
yes.
which is like an essay. I've kind of made it more of an essay now, and it's going to be in my book of essays coming out next year. But yeah, because the way that you engage with film and characters and, you know, Keanu Reeves in that book made me think about like what are my points of reference for mixedness, of which there were still are very few, and kind of just wanted to create some kind of little book that didn't exist before, of my own kind of reflections on that. So that was really exciting.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Which the centers around Mitski, right?
yeah, exactly. So an Japanese American musician, but also because we were talking about low culture, I think I talk about X-Men in this. There's an actor, what's her name? Olivia. Oh, I can't remember her name now, but there's a mixed race actor in the X-Men, which I was reflecting on as well in this, which I think I wouldn't have thought about if I hadn't thought so much about Keanu Reeves. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Yeah, it was funny, the process of writing that essay. Um, it was kind of quite a like off the cuff idea I had, which then when I was forced to follow through and write, did I? I mean, I felt I had kind of had to hold myself back from writing more about Keanu Reeves and his films because my editor kept trying to tell me it wasn't a work of film criticism, that I kind of wanted to include those images as well. And because especially when you were talking about, I think it made me realize the extent to which, yeah, films, especially I guess, were kinds of texts which were really important for me in terms of navigating my cultural identity.
Yeah.
And I wonder if it is more of a feature of like, I don't know, being of like kind of diasporic identity, that you don't, when you're not embedded in a particular community, or you feel like you have like lots of different communities that you're kind of semi part of, that you have a toe in, the films, albums, music, these things become more important as like linking ways of like touchstones, which I don't know, that's kind of one thing I was wondering when I was reading your book and thinking about Keanu Reeves and how important he is to lots of different people in that way. But and actually, I kind of had a wider question to do with this. This is something I've been thinking about, and I don't know if this will link into your next object or to I'm a Forest Fire, but whether the process of putting together Magnolia, whether you kind of felt like you discovered new things about how yourself, your identity in the process, or whether it was an important part of that, yeah, or like how you link your writing generally. Would you link it to a kind of arc of like self finding or self knowing?
Yeah, I guess I would, but I'm kind of always writing about the particular questions concerning like what it means to be mixed race and have multiple, like so many different places that feel like they might be homes, almost too many, so that I can't kind of anchor myself to one place. I think it comes back again and again. And I wonder if in Magnolia I was able to play around so much with form and find a kind of poetic form where I could really feel at home. I think writing in between a kind of prose and poetic form really helps me to it's really freeing, and generally poetry is really freeing for me. Yeah, and I think letting myself use like multiple languages is one way that I found that all these different disparate aspects of my growing up are able to easily coincide in poetry, I think. So I think it gave me that. Subconsciously, I'm sure I've learned lots of new things, but I think I'm still always writing and rewriting into that question. What about you?
I guess, like we were saying about publishing, and maybe it's like too soon to say, you kind of don't publish the finished thing. You kind of publish, you put stuff out there, and then you work out in the months and years after what it was, what that meant, and then you
Probably, yeah.
'cause I still feel that about the book. Yeah, that I guess maybe what makes it poetry rather than an essay. Whereas when I was writing Mixed Race Superman, I don't know if you're having this experience writing your book of essays, I felt tied to an argument and to evidence and like modes of logic, which I did have to be quite clear on in my head, even to allow a kind of ambiguity at points. I still had to, yeah, I was making an argument at the end of the day, or like several different complex arguments.
Yeah.
Whereas with Rendang, I'm not making an argument. I mean, I've always seen poetry, and I've come to see it more this way as like kind of language which is aware of itself, or a kind of like state of heightened linguistic self-awareness. And I think where that comes in intersectional identity is that it exposes, or for me, when I write poems, exposes the extent to which language constitutes a cultural identity. And obviously there are real communities, but then a lot of the other things we think of our identity are actually just kind of linguistic constructions, things like, nationality, for example, is a big one, A lot of nationality isn't felt until it's written about. That's like the big thing that Benedict Anderson writes about in Imagined Communities. These are things which arise with like print capitalism, as he calls it. And one of the things that poetry can do for me is like break that back down. Kind of you return to this almost like soluble state in which words kind of signify different ties culturally and kind of recombine in different ways.
I think what poetry gives me is the fragment, and like I feel almost everything that I write in some way is kind of hinging on the idea of fragments and fragmentary identity, fragmentary meaning, memory especially perhaps. And I think it's like in my very early reading, which when I was kind of doing my MA, I was thinking a lot about this and reading, I've already mentioned her, but again, Anne Carson a lot. And this gave me something to begin to like break apart in myself and in my writing.
Yeah, I love the way she talks about fragments. Is it in the Paris Review interview? She talks about them, where a line in Sappho just like breaks off and it kind of like opens out. She like talks about it giving her like a spooky feeling. Really, like stuck with me. Is a really cool way to describe what they can do. Well, but it means a kind of like magical feeling as well. It feels like alive and real in a way that. Exactly. That actually kind of brings me on to one of my objects.
Oh,
which I don't really know what to say about because it's just an object which is.
Oh yes.
Which is I wrote a poem about this brick. A poem called Say, which has these brick-like stanzas, shape of this brick, which was a brick that my dad found in the Thames. Like I think after he retired, he just had a lot of free time. He doesn't have a huge amount of hobbies, so he just started walking on the Thames and he just pick up these things he found there, and he found this brick one day and he like mounted it on this because he was an antiques dealer, so he would fix antique broken things, and so he's good at food with his hands. And so he mounted it on this little piece of wood and gave it to my partner.
Wow.
And I didn't really think about it that much until then. It kind of like it all kind of then he became ill later. And what's kind of ironic about this work of art on my dad's part is that he's very inarticulate. He's not really a very verbal person. But then when I was kind of trying to write about my feelings about my dad's illness, and I think I had a lot of like stuff that was pent up, this kind of brick became this kind of metaphor for it. And also the fact that it's broken and it's still saying something, and it feels like it kind of brings together a lot of the things I was trying to express in the book. In fact, I sometimes think this brick is like basically interchangeable with the book. Like, just
I love that. Yeah. It's really interesting that it wasn't given to you. I like how that complicates it as well. And I've heard you speak about the brick before, and it's really thrilling to see it almost in the flesh on screen.
What I love about it is that people often, well, like the few people I've talked about the poem assume it's a metaphor. And, but it's not. There's a real brick. Which again is like another thing I like about poetry, which is that it's like midway between fiction and whatever, life writing, memoir, arts, other things. And you're like, what is, is this real? Was this person? Yeah. That kind of question is always an exciting one. Anyway, do you want to share something?
Sure, yeah. I've also got an object that has writing on it. So this is a pair of chopsticks that belonged to my grandmother. So when she passed away last year, the year before last, my mum, when it was time for the funeral, I couldn't fly. I was living here and I couldn't really fly back to Malaysia, which I immensely regret now, of course. But and my mum kind of did this clearing out of the kitchen, which was very much my grandmother's domain, and gave me a weird assortment of pots and pans and a set of chopsticks. And so I think they feel like ivory, but I don't think they're actual ivory. I think they're that kind of imitation ivory. And they have got this like beautiful engraving on the kind of on this end. They're quite though it's like a very common chopstick pattern I've since, after like looking at closely at lots of chopsticks. So I don't think they're particularly like special or valuable, but what it says on them is 百年好合, which I looked up, and it basically means like a lifetime of happiness, and it's a common kind of thing that you say at a wedding. So this would suggest that these are a wedding present, although they might not be, because I think it's just like a generic common chopstick design, but I like the idea that they could be a kind of wedding present to my grandparents, which would make them very, very old.
Yeah.
And they're very colorful. They've got an animal kind of engraved on them, and what looks like a kind of red sun, but might just be a dot, and then another character, she, which means happiness here. And I feel like objects like these very much populate my poems. And yeah.
Have you written about those particular chopsticks?
I have, but not in a way yet that I'm kind of satisfied with. Okay. But I have written, I've tried to, yeah. I think I've tried to, I tried to write something about a kind of inventory of things that got given away from Papa's kitchen. But, and it could be something that I'm going to write, but I think I'm not, it's not finished yet.
Would you say, is your grandma an important figure within the book?
Yeah, definitely. And when I was rereading Rendang, I got quite emotional actually reading about your grandma as well.
Yeah.
And so my book is dedicated to her, but like you, I didn't get to know her when I was young, and she didn't speak English. But I'm kind of wary of, I suppose, idealizing her, because I didn't really know her, but then I do also want to write about her in some way. And so I'm kind of learning small things slowly about her now from the rest of the family, and about like her migration story, which is not something I ever thought to ask when I was younger, of course, because we never kind of think to ask these things when we have the chance. But yeah.
My grandma would, whenever I tried to, in the last few years of her life, I did try and ask her more questions, mainly via my mum, because my Indonesian is very bad. She would always just be like, "Why are you asking? Why does it matter?" She was very resistant to talking about the past.
Yeah.
She didn't. Yeah, there wasn't that same culture. Well, for her at least. I don't know if there were personal reasons to do with that. She'd had quite a hard life. She just didn't feel the need to kind of dwell on things that were difficult. Whereas for me, I was like, surely you want to pass on this information. But yeah, it's interesting. I feel like the grandmother figure is again quite like an important thing for the diaspora and second generation immigrants, and it's something I was kind of wary of, partly in
me too.
in Rendang, that it's a cliche, but then it's kind of a cliche in this slightly annoying way that, I mean, I think it's still an entirely legitimate thing to write about. It's kind of a cliche for a reason, which is that these figures are incredibly important to diaspora families, and a kind of link between the I guess the kind of like holders of often of the family history, and between a kind of more fragmented modern westernized family and kind of past. Or I don't know how you see it.
Yeah, exactly. I just thought, actually, when you mentioned about your grandma kind of saying like, why are you asking? Why do you want to know? And my white New Zealand side of the family, I've got like a couple of relatives who are incredibly into, the kind of family trees and archives, and tracing migration journeys from like Wales and Scotland and England to New Zealand, and tracing like vessels that they arrived on, and these incredible details. And I've got an amazing aunt who's like kind of made a publication tracing like the first arrivals of our ancestors. And obviously that I know there is a tradition of this as well in like diaspora families. I think, though, I definitely felt I just wish linguistically I could access these kind of this history more easily. So I think in the book that's what I'm often kind of writing about with like regret, but still trying, documenting it in a different way, especially like the questions that we ask are maybe as interesting as the facts, the dates, the voyages, the answers that we might find in documents and things.
Completely. And I feel like in the process of doing that, you're kind of you're setting the parameters of your own identity, and kind of providing kind of way markers for other people from similar backgrounds to navigate their own sense of themselves. I think your book does really amazingly.
Thank you.
I feel like we don't have that long left. Do you have anything more to
Yeah, I do. I've got one more. Shall I do mine and then we can get yours as well? Okay, so my next one's actually a book, Turning, by Jessica J. Lee, which she's a Canadian Taiwanese writer. And this is a swimming memoir, so it's not poetry. And it came out in 2016, and I first read it. This copy actually was bought by my partner, and he read it first and told me I should read it. And I read it in like the first couple of months after I moved to London a few years ago. And it's like the first time I kind of recognized something of myself in like environmental writing, and in like a kind of canon of nature writing, and made me think that I could put together some kind of book of prose about place. And this book especially is it's structured by the seasons, which is how I structured Tiny Moons. So that was really, it was just a really formative and transformational book. And not long ago I was rereading this, and something fell out of a page, which is this, it's a little pressed flower, and I found it in between the pages. I think I must have put it there after I'd gone for a walk in my lunch break when I worked for this Chinese community charity in London. It was one of my first jobs when I moved here. And I found, so this is a kowhai petal. It's a New Zealand native tree. It's bright yellow when it blooms, and it blooms in early spring. And I found one of these trees in a garden in North London, which is the poem that I read at the beginning. And the petals fall very rapidly once they've been in bloom for, I think, about 3 weeks, and they kind of scatter the ground surrounding the tree. And so I picked one up, and I must have put it in the book, although I don't actually remember doing that. And then like a year later, I picked up the book and found this in the pages. And so I keep it in there now. And I'm always writing about this tree. So that's my object.
Oh, that's a brilliant object. Okay. All right, I'll just close with my object briefly. I'm going to choose this one. I actually have like an array of things, array of potential objects, which is a similar book, which has been really important to me actually since finishing Rendang, which is Lose Your Mother by Sadia Hartman, Journey Along the Atlantic Slave Route. And it's just, in terms of some of the things we've been talking about, navigating almost the kind of paradoxes of identity, of like as a second generation immigrant, diasporic subject. She goes to Ghana following the slave route and talks to a lot of people there who, historians, locals, and other Black Americans who've made that journey too. And a lot of people who've basically gone there expecting a kind of to achieve a sense of like understanding or like wholeness or fulfillment, and who were basically treated by Ghanaians as obruni, like strangers. And so she articulates amazing the sense of basically perpetual strangeness when you are a kind of subject of history, and when you're not in control of who you are, if you're not, if you don't have the ability to like trace your family tree back generations in the same place. And it's full of amazing phrases. Like she talks about not having the self-forgetfulness of belonging, and I've just been thinking about that a lot as maybe as articulating something I've always felt, which is that belonging is actually this form of forgetfulness, and that one of the things you have if you're a diasporic subject is you're always aware of where you are and who you are in that place. You can never just melt back into the background. And anyway, it's also an amazing work of history, memoir, travelogue, and I think it's something that's kind of filtering into the stuff I've been writing since.
Thank you. That's amazing. I've just actually started her other book and it's incredible. So I'm going to read that one as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. I guess we should wrap it up here. But yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nina. And yeah, it's nice talking. Bye.
Yeah.